Keenan, Mike, and Keel. Keenan, Mike.
Keegan, Mike, and Key.
You also said it wrong, by the way.
Yeah.
Keenan, Michael, Key.
Keegan, Michael, Key.
Fuck, did I say Keenan again? Probably.
Yeah, that's
'Cause
Keenan
Kenan
Thompson.
Thomas.
That's someone else.
Keegan, Michael, Key, and Jordan Peele. Welcome to the Linen Suit and Plastic Tie podcast. This is the podcast where we work to dissect and analyze the amazing, the epic, the cool, the interesting, the awe-inspiring power of storytelling and learn how to harness that power in our everyday lives. I'm Gaurav.
And I'm Kevin.
Kev, two of my favorite storytellers, and I've been watching a lot of their old stuff, is Key and Peele. They're such diverse and interesting storytellers. And I saw Key speak at Ad Week, an event in New York last year. And I've been rewatching a lot of their skits, and I can't unsee this. He talks about how the Key and Peele skits and comedy as a whole is about escalation. You start at a 1, you go to a 2, then to a 5, then to a 5,000, and then to a million. And you just got escalating the situation at exponential rates until you're in this hugely comedic, tension-building moment at the end, right? And then all the steam gets let out. And this is the thing Key and Peele does really well, is it takes you on this journey, right? Where it ends in this ridiculously huge situation, but you understood how you got there. You started grounded. You started in a situation that could exist. If you start at 5,000, it's really hard for people to catch up or believe or lean in because we're storytelling beings, right? You got to start with any audience where they are. And something that I encourage everyone listening to go back and watch Key and Peele and look at that and look about where they start at a 1, see how they move to a 2, see how they move to a 5, a 7, and so on. Like the substitute teacher, where he starts with kind of simple names and he starts not super angry, but then the names get more ridiculous and he gets angrier. And if you just watch the last 5 seconds of that skit, you're like, oh my God, this is insane. But if you watch the whole journey, you see how he got there, right?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And you're able to see that contrast between 5 and 1 and 2. You find it funnier as an audience, whereas if you just start at 5, you don't get that contrast.
Yeah, the setup and the punchline. And I find it even more interesting is now that in this kind of modern age, you're seeing a lot of their skits being cut up for TikTok and YouTube. And like, if you know the skits or you've seen it a bunch of times, you know parts of it's missing. You know they cut things. And I'm always like, when you watch the real skit, it's so much funnier. But these smaller skits are still funny because they're cutting middle parts. So instead of going from 1 to 5 to 10 to 12, you're going 1 to 10 to 12, right? They're cutting the middle parts, but still escalating just a little bit faster. And that's why their skits work so well with TikTok and YouTube. It's just fascinating. And you can apply that really to any type of story you're telling, where obviously maybe if it's a business pitch or something like that, you don't want to end at 5,000. But this idea of meeting the audience where they are, understanding what the 1 is, and then slowly escalating it to get to where you want them to be is crucial for any form of storytelling. Anyways, Kev, who are we talking to today?
Well, today we are talking to Jonathan Knight. He has had a very decorated career in the gaming industry, from Activision to Electronic Arts, Zynga, Warner Studios, and most recently, the New York Times. And you heard that right. Jonathan has worked on some of the best-known gaming titles known to the industry and our society, like Quake, Wolfenstein, The Sims. You might have heard of that. The New York Times in recent years are able to push their fleet of games to new heights with popular titles like Wordle, their long celebrated crosswords, Spelling Bee, and a whole lot more. So we're going to talk to Jonathan about his career in gaming, the storytelling in some of the video game genres he's worked on, and how games are impacting the New York Times and allowing it to become one of the most creative and innovative companies out there.
According to Axios, the New York Times game app was downloaded 10 million times last year. The New York Times is creating relevant games while staying truthful to the historic and cultural impact that the New York Times crossword has. And it's a really interesting story about staying true to a company's story and culture and the way the audience interacts and feels about that brand. So Kev, let's get into it.
Hello, how do you do? Sit down, gather around. We've got stories about stories that'll mix you a drink of wonder and mystique. Cause life can be dry, better dress for the times with the linen suit and plastic tie. Linen suit and plastic tie. Now here's Gorib and Kevin.
Jonathan, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? What is your story?
Yeah, well, it's great to meet you guys. My story is I'm kind of a lifelong game maker, I guess. I actually started in sort of a former life as a director for the stage. I wanted to be a theater director and got my master's degree from Boston University at their theater conservatory there and directed a few plays and worked with actors. I also did a bit of writing and stage management and hanging lights and building sets and everything. So I was kind of a theater junkie for a while. But I also, from childhood, had an Apple II computer growing up and was playing computer games and video games and learned to program at a young age. And so I had this kind of dual background as a computer programmer, amateur programmer, and a kind of a theater junkie. So I combined that in the 90s into what became a career in computer and video games and just kind of went from there.
That intersection between theater and games is so important. Having a fundamental understanding of storytelling can help you in all fields, especially gaming. Can you tell us about some of those lessons you got from this kind of theater background that you see yourself applying every single day?
Yeah, it's interesting. You would kind of think on the surface of it that directing a play is pretty different from building a video game. But, I sort of found a career at the intersection of entertainment and technology before it was cool, I guess. I think first and foremost is sort of empathy for the user, for lack of a better phrase. We certainly didn't call it that in the theater. But when you're directing a play, you're sort of sitting there during final dress rehearsals, imagining that you're the very first audience member to come in on opening night, and you put yourself in the sort of place of an audience member, and you try to experience the play as they would be experiencing it, and you're sort of looking for opportunities to make it more entertaining and all of that. And I think that sort of translates when you're working on games. You're always putting yourself, especially if you're like in kind of a creative role or a production role, you're putting yourself in the role of the first time user and trying to set aside like your biases from having worked on it and just imagine how users are going to experience it. So I think that was similar. I think I would also say when you're directing a play, you're working with a pretty diverse and set of people who are, whether it's a costume designer or an actor or, a technician or a producer, you're working with people who kind of like come at the problem from all different angles and come from different personalities and backgrounds. And some are more introverted, some are extroverted. And I think game making is a lot like that too, with software engineers and producers, product managers, designers, data analysts. You have to sort of bring together a pretty eclectic set of functions and diverse backgrounds and try to build consensus. So those are some of the lessons that I think I learned early on that ended up actually helping me later, even though it wasn't obvious at the time.
Yeah, and I kind of want to get into your experience making games. You worked on Quake, you worked on Wolfenstein, and obviously The Sims. From your perspective as a producer and also with your background in drama and directing, was storytelling a big focus in gaming back in those days when you were working on those titles? And how have you seen that evolve the gaming industry over the years?
Big question. That's a big topic. Yeah, storytelling was always important, and games are pretty diverse. You get lots of different kinds of games, and they can be as different from one another as, a movie is from a game. I would say, yes, it was always important. One of the first I mean, I grew up on Apple II games. I grew up on Zork. I grew up on Wizardry, Ultima, by Lord British, and these incredibly early games when the graphics were so simple, or they were just straight up text games. You still were able to create incredible narratives and sort of the world building and all of that. So it's always been important, and I think there's always been a little bit of a dynamic between just putting the player at the center of it and not having too much directed storytelling and just letting them tell their own story and be the hero of their own story. And as an industry, we've also had periods in which graphics suddenly got better. A new console came out, there was a movie, and we just do a movie game. At EA, we did a series of Harry Potter console games, and they were just like straight up play the movie. You play Harry, you go through all the same scenes that he did in the movie, and those games in those days would make a lot of money, and they were really, amazing because they had never really been done before. But I think pretty quickly people sort of tired of, put me on rails and just let me experience the movie. I saw the movie. I don't really need to experience it with crappier graphics. I want to be in the world of Harry Potter, but I want to be the hero of my own story. And I think with the latest Harry Potter console game from Warner that came out a couple of years ago, which was really well received, that was the whole premise. We're going to set Hogwarts in the 1800s, and you're sort of like character, and then the world is incredibly high fidelity and true to the Harry Potter universe, but the story is sort of one of your telling as the player. But anyway, I mean, for me specifically with Wolfenstein, that's when, for me personally in my career, I realized like I want to be closer to the actual creative development of these games, as opposed to being just sort of a producer that's managing things, managing ports and SKUs. And so that's a little bit of when I made the move up to EA to work on The Sims. But at the time the Return to Castle Wolfenstein went into development, that was an inflection point, as I recall, because it had really dominated the first-person shooter category, from Doom to spin-offs like Hexen, which were done by Raven, and then, of course, Quake. And then along came this little game called Half-Life from kind of an unknown developer at the time called Valve. And, we all played that, and we were like, oh, man, they've taken the first-person shooter category to a different place. Like, it was so scary. Like, you would literally not want to be alone playing the game. And they were doing cutscenes, but not in a traditional way where you sort of interrupt the action and then you play a cutscene and then you get back to the action. They were really integrating storytelling and cutscenes in a way where they wouldn't take control away from you. You still had full control, but the cutscene was kind of happening in real time all around you, and stuff would kind of jump out, or you'd like trigger some sequence, and some turn the corner and there's a guy running down the hall, and obviously all of that nowadays is pretty straightforward, standard fare. But that was a real breakout moment, and I think it was a moment for everyone who was working on first-person shooters to really think about how that category had changed.
I also kind of wanted to get into The Sims a little bit. The premise of that game always fits perfectly with what we want to explore in this show, because in a quite literal sense, you get to create a different imaginary life for yourself that allows them different possibilities than otherwise they have access to in real life. Were there any key missions or principles that as a game developer you were trying to achieve? What kind of experience are you trying to create?
The thing about The Sims is that it's a simulation. It's like you said, it's a game about life. And so, from the perspective of storytelling, it was a different approach. We thought of it as like a software toy, that we want to give players the right toys to play with. It's like a digital dollhouse. And, we want to give them the rooms and the set dressing and the people, but really let them set up either, then maybe they want to recreate their own life in The Sims, or maybe they want to create a fantasy life. But, we didn't want to really dictate to them the stories that they wanted to tell. We wanted to enable them with, the best possible tools and toys to do that. And so, the genius of Will Wright was his architecture of The Sims was kind of radical at the time. It was object oriented in the sense that the game was infinitely expandable with objects, and the animations of the Sims characters were embedded in the objects, not in the characters. And so the characters didn't have fundamentally kind of a limitation on what they could do. it was, you would drop a soccer ball into the environment, and the soccer ball contained the animations for how to kick me, how to play with me, how to bounce me. And so because of that, it was infinitely expandable. Like, here's a waterbed, and we can drop that into the game, and like then the Sims would get on it and it would be funny. And so because of the technical architecture of the game, it seemed like the possibilities were endless. And at the core of it was sort of a very simple kind of life simulation based on human needs. We all have these needs. We need to eat, we need to sleep, we have a need for love. We will sort of built, and the team built those basic human needs into a very simple simulator that said, if these things are going to decay over time, I'm going to get hungry. Once I hit sort of a hunger threshold, I look around the world and see, are any of these objects out there able to satisfy my hunger? And if so, I will go interact with them. And then again, the animations for what happens is embedded in the object itself. And the rules were quite simple. And I think that was the genius of it. And then there was just a little bit of randomness tossed in, just enough that, occasionally a sim would go into kind of mode of failure, even though there's a toilet right there and they could use it. Every once in a while, they just don't make it and they pee on the floor, and just enough kind of chaos and randomness put into the system. And then from there, we just always were designing for systems, and that was the key. And the stories told themselves, and it was just like this magical thing happened where even though the rules were very simple and there was a little bit of randomness, stuff would happen in the game and people would read so much into it. They'd like bring their own imagination of what was happening, and they would like, we didn't have to work that hard to tell stories because the players told the stories themselves. And then ultimately they ended up, it's one of the first games with UGC, is the first games where the, kind of machinima and people would like do screen caps and ultimately video captures and like create little movies out of the Sims. And that ended up becoming kind of a massive part of the franchise. So, but yeah, that was a really fun and exciting time and a very different kind of challenge to build the toys of storytelling instead of the actual story.
Yeah, I know, it's so interesting because one of the things about The Sims that is so fascinating in this version of storytelling is it's reclaiming your story. It's the stories we tell ourselves. We had a psychologist on the show that talked about how scary movies and superhero stories can be really good at helping us kind of experience things without actually having to go through it and learn the lessons and connect and build empathy with characters and experience things through them without having to go through that trauma. It's building parasocial relationships with characters and allowing you to experience them in a safe way. And Sims is so fascinating because it allows you to do that. It allows you to explore different parts of your life, different avenues, different interests, and through that character, learn a little bit about it. And whether you take that in the real world or you don't, it's amazing. This, like you said, the first kind of burgeoning sense of UGC, which we now see in user-generated content through all these different platforms. It's that first sense of exploring different ways to live and kind of reclaiming and writing your own story in a very controlled setting. So I think that's such a fascinating thing. It talks about the expansiveness of games. There's the very controlled games, like where you follow a story, you do what they say, they won't let you do anything else, you follow it, and you get encapsulated in a story that's written for you, to these expansive games like Fortnite, like Sims, where you can kind of choose your own adventure a little bit more and kind of reclaim your story in that sense. And they're both storytelling. Storytelling plays an equal role in both of them, but it comes to a different result. I do want to pivot, and I want to start talking a little bit about your work with the paper on record. The New York Times. The New York Times games over these past few years, since the pandemic especially, has really gotten a lot of attention. We're talking a lot about these big games like Wordle. I know I'm a big fan of the Sudoku. I tried Wordle this morning. I haven't been a big fan of Wordle, to be honest. I never really got into it. I tried it this morning. I struggled with it. I tried to cheat with ChatGPT. And then at the end, I came very close and I almost got it.
I actually didn't get the Wordle today myself, and I broke a 217-day streak, which was very painful way to start the day.
Oof, I'm sorry. That's tough. It's interesting how deep that has become into culture and the shareability of it. And I think it's interesting because with the New York Times, a lot of people are like, well, what does it have to do with the Times? But crosswords have been an essential part of the New York Times for decades. So can you tell us a little bit about, your journey to the New York Times and how games serve the overall mission of the New York Times today and how it has for a long time?
So I had spent about 5 years at Zynga as a general manager, and part of my time there was running the Words with Friends business. Zynga acquired Words with Friends. I ran the studio at the time that we launched new Words with Friends, and really grew the franchise pretty significantly. And it was an exciting time, and I really, enjoyed working on it. I enjoyed word games. And also the fact that it was so social, and, I played every day with my cousin, and that, thing of sort of staying in touch with family members through a daily touch point with a word game, all of that sort of originated with Words with Friends. And I had that experience. And I think, that sort of popped on my resume for the New York Times. And when they reached out to me, and, when I got to the Times, I was really excited about the opportunity. And to your point, yes, there had been this long tradition. The first crossword puzzle ran in the paper in 1942. It was a few weeks after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And, at a time when, like these days, we would call that a tough news cycle. And the paper made this commitment that they would run puzzles in the paper as a diversion from the news. And they felt that in tough times, people needed that. And so, going back to 80 plus years ago, that has been a central part of like puzzles and news sort of having that relationship. So, what happened was that around 2018, we, along the way, we transitioned to digital, both with the news and with the crossword puzzle. We started charging a separate subscription for the crossword puzzle. We had thousands of puzzles in the archives, and it was a really great offering. And around 2018, the team, was before I got there, took another paper puzzle called Spelling Bee, which runs as a variety puzzle in the paper, and turned it into a digital game. And suddenly it was building subscriptions on top of the crossword. And they realized at that point, hey, maybe we can have a portfolio of games. This is bigger than just the crossword. And that, I think, was kind of a pivotal moment. I came in 2020 as they were looking to really kind of expand and grow and chase this opportunity. Games plays a key role. Like the overall strategy of the company is, to be the essential subscription to help curious people understand and engage with the world. The news is kind of the center of our solar system, but we have these planets around it: cooking, games, Wirecutter, The Athletic. And you can think about it as like, remember when you used to get the Sunday paper? It wasn't just the news. It was like cartoons and showtimes and the crossword puzzle and shopping and all of these things. And it was a lifestyle, And so I think we've gotten back around to that now with what we call the all access bundle. And that's kind of the strategy. So, you can still subscribe just to games and enjoy the games in and of themselves. But, if you also want to take the full all access bundle, you can have, access to everything the Times has to offer. And, that's been a really important sort of diversification strategy for the company at a time, when a lot of papers are seeing a lot of economic headwinds. New York Times has more resiliency because we have these other products. And we're just really, really pleased and excited by how much New York Times games have kind of captured the zeitgeist.
Definitely. And I was talking to a friend of mine recently too, who is a New York Times subscriber, and the order which they engage with the newspapers: game section first, cooking second, and then finally land on the actual news. So New York Times games definitely have their, unique gravitational pull. What I'm curious on this part is there a particular type or theme of games that you would identify as New York Times games?
Yeah, I think a couple things make our games unique, and we talk about this a lot internally. The most important idea is that we make, our puzzles are human crafted. They're human made. They're edited. They're curated. We have real people, kind of best in class in the English language puzzle constructors and editors, who are putting this content out every day for you to solve. And, we put the editors' names on the front of the puzzles. There's a real kind of fun dynamic between constructor and solver. And that's the most important thing that differentiates us. I think after that, I would say they're daily puzzles. You do it once a day, you put it down, come back tomorrow for the next one. We're not, it's a different approach to mobile gaming. We're not trying to get you to be engaged in the app all day long, 24/7. We don't even look at, honestly, sessions per day and minutes per day. And those aren't even KPIs that we focus on. We want you to come every day, and we think it's worth coming every day, but we think it's time well spent. And that's one of our big kind of internal mantras. And I think lastly, like our games are best when they're shared with your friends and family. Like we want to create games where at the end of the game, your solution is something you can share without spoiling the game, but you can share with friends and family and create a community. And we've seen that, especially with Wordle, but also with connections in our other games, that people are coming together for that one moment of the day with friends and family to just sort of say, hey, we all did Wordle together. So those are some of the things that define it. Obviously, we're focused on games that are based in words and language. We have Sudoku, which you mentioned. We have a game called Tiles, which is all visual. So we are interested in other categories, but we have traditionally kind of dominated around words and wordplay.
You feel smarter when you play on these games. It makes you feel connected. It makes you feel like you're being productive. I think we're in this era with mobile where people are much more cognizant about how we're spending time on our phones, and it's an interesting kind of niche these puzzle games have found, where it's like, hey, you're on your phone anyways, don't go to TikTok, come and play a game. So I did want to ask you a little bit about the culture of the times and the culture of this game studio, because something we've explored a lot on the show is how important culture is to the end product, right? We had someone on the show talk about Marvel and DC, and they talked about how the culture of those two corporations reverberated through history, from the bullpen to what you see on the screen, what you see in games, what you see in comic books. What is unique about the New York Times games culture that has allowed you guys to be so successful with games like this?
Well, I think we're a very thoughtful and curious culture. It's also an incredibly respectful team. We're really focused on just having everybody like have a shared vision of the work and the games and the importance of serving puzzles to tens of millions of people every day and the role that plays in people's lives. And it's very important work, even though it's playful work. And so I think that, what has enabled us to win is that sort of combination of real curiosity and thoughtfulness. We're a data-driven company. We're an analytical studio. We do a lot of research. We talk to a lot of users. So I think, and some of that feels appropriate to the larger enterprise, right? Which is like the mission is to seek the truth, and our strategy is around, engaging curious readers. And I think that flows through all parts of the organization, including games and how we work. But yeah, also treating each other with respect and really just trying to get to the best possible outcomes for our users, regardless of where the ideas come from.
Yeah, I love that thoughtfulness, that curiosity. It's really interesting to see how the New York Times has dealt with this innovator's dilemma problem, where you're branching some of the key cultural parts of the overall organization in the games part of the app, and making sure that these games are core to your overall strategy instead of just like kind of jumping at these fads. I think that's so great to see, because you see companies struggle with this, right? You've seen companies so many times try to enter these new arenas and jump on these new fads and not really know what they're doing. And if it doesn't connect with the overall mission, what are you doing, right? So I think it's really interesting how you guys have kind of found that balance.
100%. And people are always asking me, what do you recommend we do, and how can we use games to increase readership on our news product? And or we have people that are imitating us, and that's obviously very flattering, but I think sometimes it sort of misses the bigger context, which again goes back to 1942, and sort of like we have 10,000 crosswords in the archive now, and games and puzzles has been part of our DNA for a really long time. And then the acquisition of Wordle and, the internal games that we develop that are not just sort of copycats, but they're bringing our own unique kind of flavor to things. And then also our audience, and sort of building off of that, like all those things are difficult to just quickly replicate. It's part of a long journey that we've been on for a while.
I do want to take a step back and talk about kind of the arc of your career from a storyteller perspective. You've worked on some really story-heavy games, like you mentioned Harry Potter, and you mentioned some of these different franchise-based games and studios you've worked with. Branching now, as you moved into like Words with Friends and Sims even, and Wordle, how important, because these are less classical story-heavy games, like people don't watch Wordle and learn more about Harry Potter, right? How important is storytelling still to your career and to kind of your leadership style at the New York Times? Is storytelling still a really important part of your game development strategy?
Or the word story is it can have so many meanings, right? And you alluded to this earlier. And even at the New York Times, like we use the word story to describe, a piece of news. Like, the story ran on the front page of the paper. We did a story about, Trump taxes. I think, like, even when it's a real world bit of journalism and it's a reporting of something that happened in the real world, the fact that we still call that a story, right, says something about us as a species in a way. And I think and there's a lot of science to back this up, and I'm not a scientist, but I think that the way we process information is we create narratives around it, in our brain, and sort of how we can interact with information is we feel this need to, the story in my head. So I don't know, if you ask my team, I mean, they'd probably laugh and say that I'm known for cheesy analogies, and I'm always trying to create analogies in the way that I lead and work with the team, because I think it's important if you're trying to get a big concept across to a team, piece of vision or strategy, or help people understand why we're making certain decisions, then analogies, which in a way are sort of a form of storytelling, right, can really help get everybody on the same page. But at the end of the day, I'm not, I try to keep some writing projects on the side, in my personal life. I'll have periods when I'm working on something, like Dante's Inferno or Return to Castle Wolfenstein or for the Harry Potter game, where writing as part of my job, I'm developing a story with the team, or I'm working with writers. The Simpsons was incredibly gratifying because I got to work with the writers of the television show, Matt Selman and the whole crew there. And like, we wrote a video game with them, in those moments, I get that creative itch is really satisfied at work. But then I've had other times, like currently, where I'm working on games that don't have story components at all. And so I try to have some creative projects on the side to scratch that itch.
What does the New York Times brand kind of mean to you? I'm curious. What do you think about when you think about the New York Times brand, and how does that affect your work?
The New York Times, the mission is to seek the truth and help people understand the world. And it means a newsroom that can report without fear of, retribution, without fear or favor is the phrase we use. We strive, we don't always get it right, and our publisher will be the first to tell you that. But when we don't get it right, we're the first ones to say we didn't get it right, often. And we use it as a learning moment and try to get better. Nobody's perfect, but I think of all of the journalistic institutions, we do stand apart. And part of it is the way that the company is structured and run. But the newsroom has independence from undue business influence. And I really do see that day in and day out, despite, whenever we stub our toe and it makes headlines of its own, the reality is that I've never seen a group of people more committed to that kind of integrity in journalism. So it's really inspiring. And I think of my role at the company as, helping make us a more profitable company so that those journalists can get out of bed in the morning every day and do their work without worrying about the business, right? And so then that's why I get up out of the morning, and it's great. There's real meaning to the work.
Have the New York Times games influenced or changed or enhanced the Times' brand overall? How does the game aspect and the journalism aspect coexist or create synergy with each other?
I mean, I think the New York Times games has had a positive impact on the overall company brand. Whenever you see, our games showing up in the monologues of late night talk shows, when you see Anderson Cooper interviewing Monica Lewinsky about her Wordle habit, when you see Bill Gates writing a blog about, analyzing his Wordle score every day, or literally like British royalty playing our games, the vice president tweeting about, it's so fulfilling. And I think, we were recently named by GQ as one of the top 20 most creative companies. And, that you can imagine this 170, 100 whatever year old gray lady, being considered a creative, innovative company. There's a lot more going into that than just games, because we are doing really creative work across all of our products. But I do think we've had a positive impact on the brand, and I think it's right on strategy, which is, to be the essential subscription, to have news at the center, but a collection of lifestyle products that balance a portfolio and solve a greater number of user needs than just news would alone. So I would say it's working, it's on strategy, and I'm really proud of the impact we're having.
To be mindful of your precious time, we have this closing segment called Suspenders. This is where we ask you a random question that's unrelated to anything whatsoever, and you can give us any answer you feel like. The question of the day is, if you can instantly become an expert in any field, what field would you choose?
That is a really good question. Ironically enough, based on the topic here, it would be on how to tell great stories. And then you've brought me on here because you think I'm good at it. But, I think the more I learn about writing and storytelling, the more I learn that I don't know enough. And the more I have such respect for some of these writers and authors and filmmakers. Anybody can pick up and just write a book. We can all take a month off and write a novel. Most of us will write a terrible novel. And there's a few people out there that are just really working at it day in and day out, year in and year out. And those grand masters of writing and storytelling, I would love to know everything about how they pull together worlds and story arcs and conflict and character, because it's, they make it look so easy, but it's really hard to do. I always wanted to be a writer from a young age, like an actual professional writer. I'm making money by selling books. I don't think I'll ever get there, despite having had a really satisfying career working on lots of stories. So yeah, that's my ironic answer.
No, that's amazing. That's exactly what we're trying to do on this show. So great way to end the episode. Thank you so much for joining us. We learned so much. Welcome back to Top Hat. This is the part of the episode where we dissect and analyze and summarize some of the cool and epic storytelling learnings we got from this week's expert storyteller. We had the amazing Jonathan Knight. Kev, what did you think of our guest?
Gaurav, it is surely an educational experience to talk to someone who's had such a decorated career working on Quake and Wolfenstein, working on The Sims. Everybody knows about The Sims, and video game adaptations of big film and TV IPs like Harry Potter, The Simpsons, and of course, the New York Times games. Jonathan, throughout his career, has really tapped into many different genres within video games, and it's so cool to learn all about those, understand how storytelling has played a role throughout his career.
You bring up an interesting point about iconic IP. The Simpsons, Harry Potter, those have crucial and deep and interconnected audiences who've experienced levels of content that would be very hard for anyone to truly grasp and get their head around, right? And I think understanding these audiences, understanding these IP, understanding how to connect with them and expand them while staying core to them is essential. And I think that's why the New York Times games have been so successful, because his team has taken it, like Harry Potter, like The Simpsons, as a beloved and historic IP that millions of people have a connection to, and created games with that level of respect. And that was something that I found super crucial about Jonathan Knight and his team, and this dedication to creating thoughtful and curious games, and leaning into the New York Times IP to build on top of the history of the New York Times crossword, a game that has a huge cultural relevance, and finding ways to expand it and connect with it so that not only does the New York Times crossword stay relevant, but it still expands what the New York Times is trying to accomplish and leads people into the type of storytelling the New York Times does. And that's by being in that culture and being an avid part of it instead of trying to overhaul the entire thing.
Because this is such a particular set of games that fits so well with New York Times brand, it doesn't feel out of place. And we've seen many companies that try to branch out of their core business but fail at that. So it is incredible to witness the success of New York Times in the gaming industry. And something else that was really cool to learn about from Jonathan's career is we really got to learn from him as a producer of The Sims how simulation games provided a storytelling platform for the players and the magic of this genre of games. Because typically, when I think about storytelling in gaming, I think about the games that have strong narratives that are story driven, and some of them are being, transported even outside of video games into film and TV, like The Last of Us. But The Sims is inherently not story focused. It doesn't have a central story that drives you. It is a playground for you to create your own characters, interact with the environment and all the objects within it. But since we are such story-driven beings, when we're playing those games and we control the characters with the environment, when something happens, we interpret those things into stories that are funny, entertaining, insightful, or maybe even sentimental. And that gave birth to so much user-generated content and was ultimately able to contribute to the popularity of The Sims as one of the best-known video game franchises in history. It's just cool to learn about yet another way that video games can provide tools to tell impactful stories. And this has been another great episode of the Linen Suit and Plastic Tie podcast. If you like our content, make sure to subscribe and follow us wherever you listen. Leave us a comment and review to let us know what you're thinking. Follow us on Instagram and TikTok at LSPTPod, LinkedIn, Linen Suit and Plastic Tie.
Thank you for your time. It means a lot to us, and we're going to keep doing what we're doing. Have a good one.